Chapter 4. Fields and Villages, Rural England in 1900. If London was the beating heart of the empire, then the villages and fields spread across England were the breath that sustained it. In 1900, more than a third of the population still lived in the countryside, where life moved at a slower pace but faced unprecedented changes. On a spring morning, the English countryside emerged beneath a thin veil of mist. Church bells rang out across the fields, awakening villagers to their daily labor. Along narrow dirt lanes, geese waddled in rows, and horse-drawn milk carts rattled toward the nearest market town. The air was far cleaner than in smoke-filled London, yet poverty and uncertainty cast long shadows over life here.
Agriculture and change.
For centuries, agriculture had been the backbone of rural England. But by 1900, it was in crisis. English farmers were struggling to compete with cheap grain from America and meat imported from New Zealand and Australia. Many estates were abandoned, and pastures gradually replaced wheat fields. Farmers, dressed in thick coats and heavy rubber boots, trudged across damp land, often unsure whether the next harvest would be enough to cover their debts. On the great landed estates, landowners, usually aristocrats or the upper class, still maintained authority. They hired tenants, seasonal workers, and clung to their social position in village life. Yet the waves of industrialization and migration to the cities were weakening these old ties. Many young men left their villages for London, Birmingham, or Manchester, seeking work in factories, leaving behind aging, quieter communities.
The rhythm of village life. Despite the hardships, rural England in 1900 retained its quaint charm. Harvest festivals, Saturday markets, cattle fairs, and evenings of folk music with fiddles and wooden flutes gave villages a distinctive rhythm. The parish church was the true center of life, a place of prayer, a school for children, and a gathering space where villagers debated everything from grain prices and war news to marriages. In small, thatched cottages, families gathered around coal fires. Mothers patched clothes, fathers read wrinkled copies of the Daily Mail, while children dreamed of adventures beyond the fields that hemmed in their world. Life was simple, but never easy. A harsh winter could wipe out livestock, and a dry summer might ruin the entire harvest.
Memory and nostalgia.
For many, the countryside was the real England, peaceful, rooted in nature and tradition. Poets and novelists of the age, from Thomas Hardy to local writers of folklore, captured these villages as both picturesque and melancholy. Yet beneath the nostalgic image lay stark realities. Isolation, poverty, and limited opportunity forced many away from their homes.
Signs of change. The railways stretched even into remote villages, bringing newspapers, goods, and new ideas. Some villages saw their first electricity, small health clinics, or general stores selling imports from India or Canada. The wider world was beginning to seep into rural life. But standing in the middle of golden barley fields, all of this still seemed distant. In 1900, rural England stood between two worlds, one anchored in tradition, where church bells and harvest fairs still set the pace of life, the other opening toward modernity, industry, and the cities. And soon enough, that door would swing wide open, forcing the countryside to change forever.
Chapter 5. Knowledge and Aspiration. Education in Britain, 1900.
London, 1900. On a misty morning, the small church bell in the suburb rang 3 solemn notes. Children of St. Albans village hurried along the dirt road to the modest red-brick schoolhouse. Inside, the classroom was plain, wooden desks in neat rows, a blackboard covering the front wall. The teacher, dressed in a long brown coat, held an old book in hand and recited lines of Shakespeare in a steady voice. For many working families, sending children to school was not easy. Yet the Education Acts of the late 19th century had changed everything, requiring children to attend school at least until the age of 12. It was a turning point. Once, only the aristocracy and wealthy merchants could afford education. Now, knowledge was slowly reaching the sons and daughters of workers and farmers. In industrial cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and London, new technical schools arose to train the modern workforce. Men who could operate steam engines, handle mechanical tools, and understand the principles of chemistry and physics. Meanwhile, at Oxford and Cambridge, tradition still lingered. Students in black gowns read Latin and Greek, debating philosophy in libraries lined with leather-bound volumes. But the spirit of the age was not confined within school walls. By 1900, public libraries were expanding across towns and cities, giving ordinary people access to books. These shelves were treasure troves of knowledge, the novels of Dickens and the Brontes, the scientific works of Darwin and Faraday. In the evenings, after long days of labor, many workers attended the Workers' Institutes. In small rooms lit by oil lamps, they learned reading, writing, and arithmetic. A blacksmith once said, "We do not study to become gentlemen, but so that our children will no longer be despised." This hunger for knowledge also fueled larger dreams. Women's suffrage movements, for instance, wielded education as their weapon. Women did not only march with banners, but also wrote books, published newspapers, and delivered public lectures. Britain in 1900 was not only a land of coal and steam, but also a land of ideas, of visions to reform society. At the same time, newspapers flourished. Cheap dailies appeared, carrying news to millions. People no longer depended solely on the words of a priest or merchant. They could read about the Boer War in South Africa, about new scientific discoveries, or about fiery social debates. The press became a second classroom, shaping public consciousness. Out of this atmosphere, a new generation of Britons emerged, not only workers in factories, but also dreamers of inventions, politics, and social justice. In their hearts, they carried both the discipline of tradition and the ambition of a new century.
Chapter 6. The Dawn of a New Era. Edwardian Britain. On January 22, 1901, the bells of Westminster tolled mournfully. Across Britain, people stood in silence as the news spread. Queen Victoria, the monarch who had reigned for more than 60 years, was gone. Her long shadow had shaped the nation's identity, and with her passing, Britain entered what many called the Edwardian Age. King Edward VII, Victoria's eldest son, ascended the throne. He was not like his mother, less severe, more charming, a man of leisure who loved fine clothes, horse racing, and society gatherings. Under him, London's high society glittered in bright light, grand banquets at Buckingham Palace, theaters in the West End filled with laughter, ladies in elegant gowns, and gentlemen in tuxedos. Yet beneath this world of luxury, the other Britain remained unchanged. In industrial towns, smoke still darkened the sky, and children continued to labor in factories despite new laws. The contrast was striking. While the upper classes enjoyed polo matches and seaside resorts, the poor queued for soup kitchens in East London. This was also a time of innovation. The motor car began to appear on city streets, drawing the curiosity and sometimes the anger of pedestrians and horse-drawn carriage drivers. The Wright brothers had not yet flown, but British inventors were already dreaming of the skies. Electricity spread through homes and businesses, gradually replacing gaslight. For many, it seemed like a century of miracles was beginning. But the Edwardian age was not all peace. Britain was embroiled in the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, in South Africa, fighting against small bands of Boer farmers who resisted the empire with fierce determination. Newspapers carried images of young British soldiers marching under the African sun, while back home, public opinion was divided. Some saw the war as a matter of imperial pride. Others condemned it as brutal and unjust. In London, Hyde Park again became a stage for fiery debates. Socialists called for justice for workers. Suffragettes demanded the vote for women. On the streets, processions and protests became increasingly common. It was as if Britain stood at a crossroads, torn between tradition and reform, between empire and democracy. And yet, in everyday life, people adapted. Children played football in muddy fields. Men read newspapers in crowded pubs. Families took the new electric tram to seaside towns like Brighton. Beneath the turbulence of politics, the rhythm of ordinary lives went on, steady and human. Looking back, the Edwardian era feels like a pause between two storms. On the surface, it was an age of elegance, of social gatherings and technological wonder. But underneath, the seeds of change were already sown. Seeds that would grow into the great upheaval of the First World War.
Chapter 7. Gathering Storm Clouds. Britain before the First World War. In 1910, another momentous event occurred. King Edward VII passed away. The nation mourned, and the crown was passed to his son, George V. Unlike his father, who was a man of leisure and charm, George V was simple, dutiful, and somewhat austere. Under his reign, Britain sought stability in an increasingly unsettled world.
Social upheaval. This decade saw major social tensions erupt. The movement for women's suffrage became more determined than ever. The suffragettes, led by Emmeline Pankhurst, organized protests, hunger strikes, and even acts of window smashing and confrontation with the police. Journalists at the time called them rebellious women, but they were the pioneers of a democratic revolution. Meanwhile, the labor movement gained strength. Massive strikes in coal mining, railways, and dockyards paralyzed the nation. In London and other industrial cities, thousands of workers marched with banners demanding fair wages and better working conditions. The tension was so great that the government was forced to make concessions on multiple occasions.
Technology and everyday life. Britain also experienced a revolution in transportation during these years. Automobiles were no longer luxuries reserved for the aristocracy. The middle class began to afford smaller models. The London Underground, first opened in 1863, expanded with new lines, carrying tens of thousands of passengers daily. At the same time, advances in aviation excited the public. When airplanes were first seen flying across British skies, many thought it a miracle. Children chased after them, gazing upward in wonder, while newspapers predicted that one day humans might fly across continents.
Politics and the shadow of war. In politics, fierce debates raged over reforming the House of Lords, criticized for being too conservative and blocking progressive legislation. The climax came with the Parliament Act of 1911, which limited the Lords' power of veto and strengthened the House of Commons. It marked a crucial step toward greater democracy. Yet beyond Britain's shores, storm clouds were gathering. In Europe, Powers like Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and France engaged in an arms race. The British press warned of the rise of the German Navy, a dangerous rival that threatened Britain's maritime supremacy. Meanwhile, in Ireland, tensions between Catholics and Protestants escalated, threatening the unity of the kingdom.
Daily life. Despite these strains, everyday life retained a sense of calm for many. Children went to school in neat uniforms, families enjoyed picnics in public parks, and at the cinema, audiences thrilled to the earliest silent films. It was a world still innocent, unaware that within only a few years, everything would change forever. In 1914, when the first shots of the First World War rang out in Europe, Britons believed it would be a short conflict, over by Christmas. They were mistaken. The Edwardian era and the years of pre-war optimism closed, giving way to a storm unlike anything humanity had ever known.